Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Imagination Factory. I'm Sarah.
I'm Keith. We're going to work on what I had started last week from the suggestion of
Mhm.
was it like underwater theme? I think was your
Yeah, it was like an
um,
underwater kingdom under some kind of threat, was what it was. And that was sort of the prompt that got us started. And we had a conversation all about sci-fi versus fantasy versus rules versus, made up worlds, and kind of felt that this was sort of leaning more into the fantasy realm. We have a few things that we're trying to have a bit of staked in some form of reality, but for the most part, we thought it'd be kind of neat to just sort of break the rules. Like this could be anything down there and see where that took us.
I think everybody's kind of coming at it as a slightly different approach, but I do like the idea that something that it could even almost it starts off as fantasy can become more sci-fi
Mhm.
themed, and I guess vice versa.
You just need to stick with whatever you decided to make up. If you change your own rules midway through, that's where it gets really confusing. And the nice thing with things that are more theoretical is that you can kind of make it up, right? Like what we're doing here in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, we don't know what's down there. So, I mean, it's possible. It's possible that these kinds of things exist down there and have this society and stuff like that. It's as long as we don't change our rules midway through, we can make it work.
Yeah, and sometimes rules kind of they come about through just having conversations or
Mhm.
realizations of like one of our other projects we've worked on, Christian County. Some
Mhm.
of those rules were only came out once we were like really starting to develop the characters and going,
Yes.
well, wait a second, like how does this thing happen? Like this character act in this world? Oh, wait a second, we haven't created a rule for this kind of thing, so therefore we need to make sure that uh, it makes sense, right?
Absolutely, especially when you're taking, something that is usually non-sentient or, inanimate and giving it life, giving it a personality, but other things don't have that. It's like, what is the rule that allows this one to be and this one not to be? So like in this example here is if we have these kind of fish-like creatures that are trainable, it's like, okay, that's great, but does that mean every fish is like that or only certain ones can be like that? Are there, certain types of creatures that have the ability to be sentient and other ones that don't? We have to kind of figure that out for ourselves so that we don't have, as an example, a talking octopus in one part, and then the next part it's not. It's like, okay, if octopus can talk, they can always talk, and we have to make sure we establish and stick with whatever we decide because it's all made up anyways.
Yeah. So let me ask you, you've worked in TV, right?
Hmm. Yep.
So do you know like when writers are doing like a TV show or something, I heard that oftentimes they don't know like how it's gonna like a series is gonna end. And
Hmm.
so therefore um they kind of what we've talked about, like right, they're trying not to like paint themselves into a corner. But how do if you don't know where the story is going to end, how do you make sure you have all those rules set up properly? Like, what are some of the things you can do?
Well, it's a great question. And to be honest, it depends on the type of show that you're doing, right? So, with certain ones where it is kind of like season long arcs versus independent episodes, right? Because in independent episodes, you can get away with a lot more. Like, if we think of something like, as an example, The Simpsons or Family Guy, they reset every episode, right? So, it's not like, okay, well, in this episode, this character lost their job and it's terrible and whatever. And then the next episode, their job is back. So you can play a little bit more with it because there isn't a continuing thread. But when you
Yeah.
start to get in something that builds upon each other from every episode with character arcs and stuff like that, you might not know where the entire series is going, but you have to at least know what where the arcs are going, where they're going to end, and then start a new one. Otherwise, you end up, like you said, just kind of ambling around, not really landing anywhere or going anywhere because you don't know what your goal was with that. And in terms of the rules, generally you kind of establish those in the series Bible. Even if it is something that says every episode resets, we have no continuity, canon is never locked, that kind of thing. If you know it, then your audience forgives that and is like, oh, well, this show just does that. They don't really follow that kind of thing. It's just a silly thing happened and we keep it moving. So it really does depend on what kind of show you're trying to create, who your audience is, and what you've promised them. Because as long as it's what you're doing, what people expect of it, you can get away with it.
Right. So the audience will be somewhat forgiving as long as you're
As long
laying
as you're
things out.
consistent, right? As
Yeah.
long as this is always what they're like, right? So again, like, I think The Simpsons is a great example of that because there's been how many origin stories of how Homer and Marge met. And they keep on re-meeting in different decades as the show continues on because now, 10 years ago when Bart was born was in, 2016 versus when it was in 2006 and when it was like it keeps going back and back. So they just keep rewriting that and people forgive them for that because they're like, yeah, they're always the same age. They live in the same space at all times. So it really does depend on what you're trying to do, whereas you're not going to forgive that to something like a Star Trek, for example, where, they've been establishing these stories for decades. And if suddenly something happens that doesn't make sense, fans get upset about it.
Yeah. Like they have the Kelvin timeline and like when they redid the movies about, what,
Hmm.
15 years ago now,
Yeah,
they were, like, in a different timeline, so things happens differently with Spock and Captain Kirk, and
exactly. But
yeah, I
they've had to
remember.
set that up, right? Or people would have been like, that's not right. Even right now with like Strange New Worlds, people know it has to end when the Kirk era starts, right? So they can't just be like, just kidding, Pike's going to keep going forever. It's like, nope, we know that that's not how the story goes. And you can't, people won't forgive you if you suddenly just blow past that and make a turn. Whereas in other types of shows, it's totally forgivable because it's fluid and flexible.
Right, but I can see a scenario where, they go into, like, again, like, an alternate history where they show this, and that's kind of a, I guess if you, the one thing that has become, like, a really, now overly used trope, but was kind of somewhat innovative like 15, 20 years ago, was the idea of like alternate realities, like where,
Yes.
or, like different universes, parallel universes type thing where
Exactly.
if
Yeah,
you
where they
wanted,
had yeah. And that's I mean, and that's also one of the easiest ways to get yourself out of a corner is to be like, "Oh, it was a dream," or, "Oh, it was an alternate reality, an alternate universe," right? It's like if you really wanna do that episode, which doesn't really fit into the canon you've established, you're like, "Dream sequence, alternate reality, something strange happened in, the space-time continuum, and whoops, we're back to normal now." And you like you said, you that used to be kinda novel, now it's a bit of a trope that gets used to get yourself out of a corner and do a story that you just really wanted to do.
yeah, yeah, eh, it's almost become a predictable thing. Now the audience has become used to it, and they're like going, "Is wait, oh wait a second, this is like another universe. This is a parallel."
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly, and that in and of itself has become an effective storytelling technique because the audience now gets it, right? It's not something that you have to explain it. You're just like, "Nope, something there was a weird flux in the timeline, but we're back. It's okay."
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to see the way that storytelling works and evolves, for sure.
Well, and that's like with our door thing, our
Mhm,
door story that we're kind of, making into, uh, like jumping around in time, and I
mhm,
mean, there's a world where this story can be in the door, right? We're if the door is some kind of mythical thing, kind of
mhm.
a fantastical thing, well, then why not be part of this world? We just haven't talked about it because we haven't really, it would be really easy to make every single thing that we create on a weekly basis or semi-weekly basis connected to the door in some way.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing to say that the door only exists, in homes on Earth. It could be underwater, right? They have palaces, they have their kingdom. There could be the door established down there. There could be something that, some kind of artifact that floats to the surface that was a part of the clock that becomes the door. Like you can you can connect things together. And I think as long as you do it in a way that your reader, your audience can nod along and be like, okay, all right, I'll buy into that. Like there's enough logic in there that I'm into it. And it's not a complete leap into the middle of nowhere. then you can sort of move around, which to your point is if you don't know, where it's gonna end, how do you not paint yourself into a corner? And that's kind of always making sure you leave enough room that you could slip something in so it wasn't weird.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's. I guess you have to decide whether or not the thing that you're painting yourself into the corner, like you that you've created a really strong infrastructure, I guess, to
Mhm,
begin with. Like that's one of those things where, like, so for example, talking about like like situation versus like procedural where
mhm.
the thing kind of resets every episode for the most part, but there are um connective tissues throughout it, right? So the characters can't behave very differently from episode to episode. They have to have a consistency, right? They have to look the same and kind of act the same.
Yeah,
They're maybe the scenario they're in is different, but it doesn't. The characters are behaving the way that they would behave in this new scenario. So, like, yeah, you could
100%.
have where you're saying like the Simpsons, where Bart or where Homer and Marge are kind of like retelling the origin, but it's updating it every decade.
Mhm.
It's still the same characters and their same behaviors and the
Yes.
same kind of look, but it's modernizing it so that it's not like, oh, well, originally they were kind of in the 80s, and even though they didn't kind of look like they were quite from, maybe almost they were from the 70s, really, something like that. But
Yeah.
in any case, another good show like that is like the Law and Order
Yes.
shows where you just have that formula of like something happens to somebody that now SVU is called in, and then they have to figure out what happened, and because current events are there's always new things happening in the world that they
Yes.
can draw from, that are always things that you wouldn't even, because new technology is making for new scenarios that wouldn't have even been thought of a decade ago, right? Like you think of social media, which has really only been around for a little bit over like it's almost 20 years at this point, right?
Yeah.
So if you take some of those episodes prior to that, I don't know if they would have conceived of that the way social media has like influenced. And now that you have AI doing the same, very similar thing, right?
Mhm.
So you wouldn't necessarily. There's just so many ripe possibilities of like uh, where they can go with that. And that I think if you want to make a show or like I should say a comic book where you don't know if you want it to end at any point, then you need to think about it in that way too. Is like, could this be something where it's like we have the new bad guy of the week or a new like scenario that the characters have to work their way out of, and then the story itself kind of like a undercurrent or connective tissue story, like like having to find your long lost father, but in the meantime you're going from town to town to town to solve mysteries, right? Like you could
Yes.
do something like that with your comic book or story as well.
Well, exactly, and I think, what you've talked about makes a lot of sense because these are very character driven, right? Like, you really established who are these people, what are they like, what do they do, what wouldn't they do, all the what are their movements like, how do they talk, and then you put them in situations, but it's always them. And anytime you go to the comic book or the TV show or whatever, you kinda know what you're getting into is these characters are doing what they do. And what the actual villain or the adventure or whatever is each episode, each book, each week changes, but you know what to expect from a storytelling point of view. Like, like the X-Files, right? Where it was like every week there was a different, alien thing or a different supernatural thing that was happening, but the characters at the heart of it were the same. There was, some storylines that slightly attached them together, but for the most part, you could drop in at any point, watch an episode and not be lost. And same with like, a comic book series like that that's episodic. You could pick up any edition and what and read it and not be like, "Wait, wait a second, I have to go back 3 or 4 to get to the point." It's like, "Nope, you already kinda know what these characters do. This is just this particular adventure."
Yeah. Like there are some comic books that behave in that way, like the Archie comics.
Mhm.
There's also been lots of like the Disney comic books. I've had like Scrooge and I
Yeah.
believe a couple of others like that have been around for decades and decades, but they're constantly like doing that. And then I guess you'd think of like Marvel and DC having their characters
Mhm.
constantly like you'd- when some of these comics were uh starting to just gain like a following, becoming more popular, but they had like it was very episodic. It was like Peter
Mhm.
Parker would have, some issue and Spider-Man would have an issue and, it would often, like, parallel and then, like, a bad guy would be introduced that would, ruin Peter's day and, whatever it is, and
Yeah.
then the next issue, you would kind of have a new bad guy, and you'd still mention what happened prior, but it was very much like a refresh every episode. And then it started becoming more complicated as the readers became like used to the format of it,
Mhm.
and then it became I haven't read one in comic like that in decades, so I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it, but I imagine there's still some things that are very, like you still have the basics of their personality and their costumes are somewhat similar and their
Yeah.
cast is somewhat similar and all that kind of stuff.
Well, storytelling's changed a lot as well, right? And especially with streaming, because streaming kind of wants you to get in and have to sort of finish all 8 episodes because it's essentially one long story just broken into sections as opposed to, TV shows when it used to be on TV, every Saturday at 8 p.m. or whatever it was a lot more contained because you had to hold that thought for a full week. So people weren't doing that in the same way. You wanted to just be like, "Oh, my characters are on an adventure, they're doing a thing. I'll catch them next time." Whereas now you're expected to sort of continually watch it back to back to back to back and hold on to this very big, complicated story. So a lot of different things are being asked of viewers and readers now. It's not as you can't just drop in the same way, because how we consume media has changed so much in the past 20 years.
Mm. So has that affected the way that you write stories, since all of
Absolutely.
that? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely, and who you're writing it for also is important too. Again, to go back to the example of Star Trek, because it's an easy one to kind of paint the picture of, in the original, like, the Next Generation and all those ones, it was very much like every episode, the same cast, but there was a completely different thing happening, whereas now the new series are basically one long season arc, right? Where
Yeah.
different things might happen in each episode, but you kind of have to follow it along in order or you're completely lost. And it changes how we consume media and how we also create media because you can't just think of it of being like, okay, what's 24 different things that can happen to them? It's like, what are two or three things spread out over 8 episodes that all of these really deep character issues and this and that and detail. It's really making the viewer really have to pay a lot more attention, watch quickly, and watch in order.
Yeah. I have to say that, actually, I mean, I don't mind that that's what, Star Trek has become, but I did like that, the Seth MacFarlane show, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, the one set in space,
Oh,
it'll
the
come to
orbital?
me. Yeah, the Orville. Yeah,
Mhm,
the Orville was excellent because I always thought that, what I really loved about the original Next Generation or the
mhm,
original show, Next Generation and those shows that came from it were that it would be that very episodic type of show, but, um like, of course, to be able to, like, create a bit of a hybrid of that where you have a little bit more of a connective,
yeah,
bringing up past episodes, which the Orville, I think, did really well. It was something was very gratifying about it. It balanced humor and drama and action and that episodic, yet taking some elements
100%.
of, like, past episodes, and building on it. It was just I thought it's what I would have wanted the new Star Trek shows to be. And
I agree.
again, like Strange New World kind of does that a bit too. I think they did go back to that kind of, a little bit more of the episodic nature of,
Mhm,
Star Trek, so that's probably why I think I like it a little bit more in some ways than Discover, right? Um,
100%.
because, like, there is going back to what I was saying earlier, which is when something becomes novel, or when it's novel, when you're first starting to tell these Star Trek, these shows where you're really connecting it. It's one long arc over a season. You're going, whoa, there's so much possibility with um, what they're doing here, and you can really get into character development, all that stuff. But then when every show is doing it, you're like, "Oh, okay. Now you wanna see you do wanna go back to what
Yeah.
used to be a little bit." So it's kind of it's I guess it becomes cyclical, right?
Absolutely, and I think too sometimes what happens as well is you almost need a bit of a palate cleanser, right? Like, sometimes there's so much, they're so intense, you're just like, "I just want something where I can just drop in, watch an episode, and move on without having to be like, well, now that I'm here, must watch all of them because it's one long episode." And I agree, like, The Orville was fantastic for that. Like, it kind of blended the season arcs with purely episodic storytelling, and Strange New Worlds has done a great job of that as well. Like, when I was rewatching it to get ready for the new season coming up, and I was like, I can skip episodes without completely missing things or whatever, watch them out of order. Whereas Discovery, there was that was not possible.
Mhm.
Everything was very much like one big long story.
Yeah, and so when you're going back to what we're doing here, there are fun ways for you to play around with storytelling